Hi friends, welcome to my channel. My name's Fiddle. Today isn't necessarily a tutorial, but more of a I don't know what I was doing, but this is what I made kind of thing. If you are still interested in trying to make your own, I did post the scavenger hunt and you'll find the list of materials and free printable pattern there. To start off this project, I coated a piece of cloth in a mixture of watered down glue. This is so it'll hold together and not come unraveled when I go to use it. And I need 4 long skinny strips for later. Originally I really wanted to use big round boba straws with the accordion section in them, but I couldn't find any. In the end I went with the fabric, and quite honestly I think it was a better idea than it would have been with a plastic straw. While the fabric was drying, I moved on and cut out and traced all of my pattern pieces, then cut them out again and doubled the layers if I needed to. This piece came about while I was writing down what things I needed to make for the room. I honestly didn't know if there was such thing as a crash cart back in the 1800s, but I was sure gonna make one. I wrote a few more things down and then I kept thinking on how or what I was gonna do to make a crash cart. The ideas were flowing, so I turned my paper over and started drawing. Originally, I wanted this thing to be a little bit more spectacular than it turned out. I wanted it to have 2 accordion type things in the center that when you turned the crank and it lit the light, it would also make the bellows go up and down to look like a breathing machine. Unfortunately, I could not figure that part out. And it was mostly because there was too much movement going up to the bellows, and then the bellows would get all sideways because there's nothing holding it stiff. It's just fabric that can move around quite easily. And because of the movement, how far it goes out to the sides, there would be no way for me to put the clear walls up to keep it encased and it still work. If you have any thoughts or ideas on how I could actually make that work, let me know because I really would like to figure it out. But even still, I am really happy with how it came out and what I did accomplish with this project. And speaking of clear sides, one of the things that I've found to make it a little bit easier is to tape the pattern to the plastic and then cut it out. So you don't have to worry about using a permanent marker or the pattern sliding around while you're tracing it. After I got all the pieces cut out, I needed to drill the holes in the birdhouse shaped pieces for the arm crank. And then it was on to the arm crank. Now that I had the first few bends in it, I needed to make sure that they were in the right place and they would work with the side attached. I took the piece that the crank arm needed to go through and took 2 metal gears and slid them on. The gears are there to help stabilize the wire, but they don't really come into play until later, but I really wanted to make sure that this was going to work with all of the components. My bends seemed to be in the right place, so I put the next few bends in, and of course after each one I test it to make sure that they're still making contact. Unfortunately, once I almost had it all put together, I realized that there was a little bit of space in between, so I actually had to use paper brads and wrap it around the box so that way it still touched the battery. Once I had all the bends in the right place, I cut the excess off. To help hold the batteries in place, I have some copper tape and I wrapped it around both batteries. This makes sure that if the wire touches even the copper, it'll still light up and not cause any interference. Okay, now I'm ready to start gluing my pieces together. The first pieces I'm going to glue together are the clear plastic. I did use resin for this, but in the end I ended up using E6000 because it kept coming apart. And I could not keep this plastic clean for the life of me, and E6000 made it worse. You could definitely tell, and there were these white streaks. I went over it with Q-tips and alcohol, and that got rid of some of it. And the rest of it, I'm just gonna say, is detail work. I did manage to hide some of it though. Next, I taped and glued the cubby compartment on top together. This is the little area that houses the defibrillators and the breathing mask. Before I can start putting the bottom compartment together, I need to put the stabilization gears on either side of the house shape pieces. To make sure the holes were in the right spot and my rod can go all the way through, I used a scrap piece of wire to glue these together on. And every once in a while I would give it a turn to make sure that it wasn't sticking to the wire. Next I glued the top compartment piece to the shelf piece. The next day my fabric was dry, and I only have a 12-inch ruler. I grabbed this piece of metal that I keep handy on my desk just for things like this, then cut two really long strips from it. With my strips cut out, I could start making the bellows accordion pieces. And I'm not really sure how to explain how to do it, but I found the center, made a triangle, and then flipped back and forth, folding the pieces over. It will naturally want to start to twist on you, kind of like doing macrame, but you can correct it by keeping it square. And unfortunately, I had to do this all over again for both of them because I made them just a bit too big and they wouldn't fit inside the clear plastic tube. Once I remade them and had them the right size, I put double-sided tape on both ends. And now onto the gauges. For these, I sacrificed two clear plastic tubes that originally had glitter in them. First, I wrapped my copper tape around the bottom end. Then I used my handsaw and cut the tube right at the edge of the copper. This plastic was a little brittle and I was worried about it cracking, but thankfully I managed to get both ends cut off. Then I poked them through the piece of chipboard that they're going to be glued to. Next, I took the other end of the tube and held it inside of the plastic so I could etch in the side how tall I needed to make them. Then I took the tape and wrapped it around the tube where I had etched it. This kind of helps keep it together so it's less likely to break and crack. To give more detail to the gauges, I cut the centers out and then colored both separately with alcohol markers. Had I left them together, they would have the same colors in the same places. Now that they're colored, I can resin them in place. First, I put resin right in the center of both of the gauges. Not enough to completely fill it, but just enough to cover the very bottom. Then I set the paper over top and kept moving it around until the resin was covering it and I had it where I wanted it. Next, I put a drop of resin on my work surface and used a toothpick to put it just on the rim of the plastic piece. Then again, I set the paper in the resin to make sure that there was contact and it was set where I wanted it. Then finally, I filled the center the rest of the way up with resin and cured it. And there's a few spots that aren't domed right. I can go in later on and fill those in. Okay, now I'm ready to finally start putting the bottom piece together. Because of its funny shape, I had to start with the underneath side piece first, then glue on one of the house-shaped sides. Then I had to poke the crank arm through the hole and glue on the other side. Don't mind the extra bits of wire, they'll be gone. But here you can see the paper brads that I added on the crank arm. Then next was the top face part with the gauges. And finally, I can glue all of this to the base. Okay, with the bottom piece almost finished, I can stick the lights inside of the gauges where they go and glue them in place. It took quite a bit of fiddling to finally get them there. Once the glue was finally dried, I could poke the light wire through the next layer and glue it on. And like I said before, don't worry about the wires that I'm holding onto right now. I'll be cutting them off later. Okay, now that I'm this far, before I can finish building the rest of it, I have to turn the next layer over and glue the bellows to the bottom, then glue the tube over top of that. The little cardboard pieces that I'm using are the cutouts from where I cut the gauge cluster circles out. They're not really necessary for the overall look. I really liked how it looked this way, and I considered keeping it like this, but then I thought it might look funny after I put the top on, so I decided to put the outside clear plastic on. And I finally did away with those extra wires, and I can completely put it together now. Starting with stringing my lights through the hole, I messed up and put it through the wrong direction because this piece is supposed to be turned upside down, and I put the wire through the other way, so I had to take it back out and start over again. Then I peeled off the double-sided tape and stuck the accordion parts to the bottom part. Sorry about the glare in this one, I tried adjusting it as best as I could. But the next thing I needed to do was make a chipboard hinge by using a ruler and a ball tool to make a crease in the chipboard. Then I cut along the line for the upper lid. Then I used double-sided tape to attach the hinge to both of the top pieces, then trimmed out that little overlap piece in the circle. To make sure I could open and close it as far as I needed to, I bent the one piece and then stuck the other piece on, so that way there was a bit of a gap in between. Then it was time for the bauble. This was originally some sort of glass Christmas ornament, but by the time it got to me, they were already broken, so I decided to keep the glass baubles. And this was a perfect opportunity to use one of them. To give it a more finished look and look like it's in a socket, I used my copper tape to wrap around just the very bottom. Then I glued it into the socket hole that I had cut in the top of the chipboard. Next was stringing the lights into the light bulb. There was a lot of this glue that I could not get rid of on the inside of the bulb, so I had just a little hole that I could get it through. Thankfully, with the low profile lights, it wasn't too hard to do. Then I could finally glue it all together. Because this is a compartment, the only part I had to glue was the portion that has the bulb. The other piece was left loose. Because I couldn't get the bellows to work, I really felt like I needed to add more to it, even though I really liked it as it was. The next thing I decided to make was the defibrillator paddles. Starting with the cord, I took some very thin wire and wrapped it around my paintbrush handle until I felt like I had enough wraps and it was long enough. Next was figuring out what to make the paddles out of. For this, I ended up cutting a piece of paper into like an iron shape or the inside part of a U, then traced it onto a small piece of chipboard and cut it out again. To get the wire inside, I used double-sided tape on my little piece of chipboard, then curled the end of my wire into a loop so that way it wasn't just a straight post, and stuck it to the double-sided tape, then added another piece of chipboard on top. Next, I cut a slit in both of them towards the pointier end. This will be where I'm going to stick the handle through. And to make the handle, I took the end of a brad and bent it just a bit and poked it through the hole. I made sure that it was completely flush against the bottom side so I can add another layer of chipboard with double-sided tape. And then finally, the final layer was a piece of double-sided tape so I could gold foil the bottom of them. I repeated the same process for the other paddle and attached it to the other end of the wire. And now it's time for a paint break. I went with a cream color for the base and painted all over everything. The only problem was that I couldn't get to inside of the clear part, so it is just the plain chipboard color, but I'm completely okay with that. Once this had a chance to dry, I did go over it with a watered down black, and quite honestly, it kind of made it look like chipboard again, so I mean, I probably could have gotten away with not painting it at all. To try to hide some of the glue, I used my copper tape as a trim on the clear part. This helped for the top and bottom, but when I put it on the corners, it didn't look right, so I left that part. Okay, now back to the defibrillators. I had to think about a few things, so that's why I did all the other stuff in between. And that's one of the reasons why most of my tutorials are that way too. Sometimes I do reorganize it so it makes sense, but a lot of times I don't just because that is where my brain goes. But anyways, I needed to make another piece of coiled wire. Then I found the center of the defibrillator wire and attached them together. I wrapped it around a few times and then I put copper tape over top of it. And now that I think about it, a bead probably would have worked just as good or better than the copper tape. This is what it looks like so far. Like I said, I think I should have put a bead there, but oh well, I can always change it out if it ever breaks. But the next part was figuring out how to attach it to the inside of the cart. And it was a paper brad to the rescue. I made a loop in the very end of the wire and slid it over top of the brad post and held it in place with E6000. Then I cut a small slit in the front part wide enough to fit the brad through. Then I trimmed the ends down and folded them over. After I pushed the ends down, I really didn't like the way that it looked on the front, so I took the button part from a brad I had cut the ends off of and E6000'd it right in the center on top. And I almost forgot about putting wheels on this. Just like the projects that we've done before, I used my donut looking wood beads, bead caps, and round metal pony beads. Okay, just one more thing left to make, and that's the breathing mask and tube. For this, I used a plastic coated wire from a light up necklace thing. On one end, I glued a small metal bead, and on the other end, I glued a bigger wood bead. That was pretty simple enough, but the next part was a little more difficult, and that was to make the mask. For this, I used resin and a silicone pointed tool. I coated the end of it with the resin and cured it. This is going to make the pointy end part of the mask where the tube goes in. To make the rounded or face part of the mask, I used a big ball tool and coated half of it with the resin. Once both pieces were cured, I attached them together and then gave them a coat over top to smooth everything out. Then I gave it a good sanding to smooth it even further, and this is what it looks like so far. It's not exactly perfect, but good enough to say it's a face mask. Then I resined the small metal bead onto the mask. To bring back the smooth glass finish, I covered it with clear fingernail polish. Then finally I glued the wood bead to the bottom of the inside compartment. And this is what the mask looks like up close. And with that, it brings us to the end of our video. I'm sorry it wasn't a proper tutorial, but there was so much that went into this that I've never done before, and I didn't want to get something wrong and you guys try it and it mess up your project. And I know this one was pretty long, and if you've made it this far, thank you so much for being here and supporting me. And if you're new, welcome. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, all that fun stuff, because it really helps me out a lot. Next tutorial, we're going to be taking it down a notch and just making a small wood burning stove. But after that, I have some even more exciting stuff coming up and I can't wait. I'm just hoping I don't lose my voice this fall like I have every other one. Thank you, Ginger, and I'll see you next time.